We're doing a series called David's Top 10, and I want to cut you off at the past. Psalm 46 was not written by David, I know that, but let's just say he was like one of the Jonas brothers, and this is a kind of, a little solo career that this song, and David really liked it too. Jonas Brothers, that was a band. I still have all their 8 tracks. All right. How many of you... Let's just be honest for a moment. How many of you, since you've been here, since worship started, have checked your cell phone for something that would really be somewhat irrelevant, but you just looked anyway? How many? Okay, great. I did not, I'd have you know. Because I put mine back with Jesse when worship starts, so I don't do that. But it's just kind of something we do, right? In life today, of technology and things moving so fast and so busy, and Assyrian, which is this insurance group, if you've ever insured some electronic through them, they did some research last year, which I thought was pretty fascinating. They said the average American today checks their cell phone for information every 12 minutes. That's an average of 80 times a day. Millennials check their phone an average of 150 times a day. Now, come on, we just do that, right? And part of it is we're almost trained. We're constantly bombarded by information. Less than a generation ago, the average person in our country was asked to process 1,600 bits of information, commercials, ads, things like that, vying for their attention every single day. That number has jumped up to 2,500, and it continues to increase. We're just constantly being assaulted in our minds to process information. Now, thankfully, our brains are incredibly powerful. We're created with all kinds of filters and things like that. That's why, you can have your wife talking to you and not even hear her because, you have this ability to filter things. No, I'm just kidding. But we're constantly processing things. And, in counseling and psychology, we're starting to see new trends develop that have really never been present in culture before, in history before. Trends like in what we call an internet addiction disorder, internet compulsion disorders, this sense of anxiety that builds inside of people when they don't have access to their phone. How many of you, now I'm just talking to myself here maybe, but how many of you have ever been leaving or getting in your car and all of a sudden you're like this? Like, precious, where's my precious? Right? Just that sense, and then I do that so often, and I realize it's in my hand while I'm going it's right here, okay? Right, so we just we're constantly doing things like this. We're so trained to be feeding on information and what's happening in Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and the news and fantasy sports and all that. It's I'm not even saying it's wrong. Sometimes things get a little out of balance in our life, don't they? And our brains are just moving so fast. There's another phenomenon in our culture right now. We call it popcorn cognition. And it's this idea that many in a younger generation now, our kids today, are able to maintain a single track of thought for about an average of 20 seconds before they kind of bounce to something else. And then they can bounce back, especially if it has hot butter on it. But they can bounce back and focus, but we ping pong all over the place with our thought life today. And I get that. I'm that way. There are times if I bless my wife's heart, she'll be having a heart-to-heart conversation with me, and then she's like, "Why are you looking at your phone right now?" I'm like, "I am? Crap." And it's like these things build into our lives. We have a hard time slowing down the process of our soul, our mind, our emotions, our thought lives. And they just ramp up and ramp up. I mean, we just get speed is king these days, right? On this, how many of you get frustrated when you see that spinning wheel on your device? Like, oh my gosh, it's been like 3 seconds, right? And it used to be 10 years ago, you'd hear that bzz, bzz, and you'd be willing to wait 5 minutes for something to come up on your computer screen. So we're just trained to go faster and faster. Cindy and I were out for dinner a while back, and we went to a restaurant with one of those revolving doors. And this guy, you could just see he got so frustrated because he missed a revolve. Like, people, he started to step in there and he kind of missed one open section, and then some people were coming out, so like he had to wait like for 2 more little triangle pieces and he was like, ah! I was like, that is sad. So when he got in there, I put my foot, because he was looking at his phone, so boom, right, anyway. I was raised with, this plethora of 30-second snippets in my life, Sesame Street taught me how to do the alphabet, and Schoolhouse Rock taught me all about conjunctions, and it was all done in these little bits of information, right? And now I can do that online. I don't hardly ever watch like the full newscast because I can just thumb through my iPad and get the highlights of what's happening in the world, and just things are just constantly doing that. And I remember years ago I was trying to slow myself down, trying to be the kind. I've been reading about this incredible saint, Brother Lawrence, who talks about the practice of the presence of God, learning to sense God's presence even in the most mundane parts of our lives. And he was fascinating because he worked at a monastery, but he tended to the garden and did the dishes basically. And sometimes even he would get frustrated because he thought he had to be in the place of prayer to be connecting with God. And God began to teach him over his season there at this monastery that it wasn't his location physically that mattered. It was the location of his heart, the posture of his life, that he began to really sense God's presence even when he was tending a garden or washing dishes. And I think how much more important that is in our lives today, to be able to have a habitual sense of God's presence in our lives. So, years ago I was at this thing, I was trying to practice this. It was a Taizé service, and these services are designed, they're a French thing that came out of the monasteries in France, but the idea was you could go and sit and listen to kind of repetitive chanting. If you've ever been in my office, like when I'm studying, or maybe you're familiar with the Benedictine monks, this kind of thing. So they would say phrases in Latin over and over again, maybe with a harp or a violin in the background or something, and forces you to kind of meditate, right? And I remember one time I was at this Taizé service, and they were saying this phrase, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom, but it was in Latin. And so I was trying to say in Latin while they were also, I think there was somebody on like a piano or something. And I just, like it was, they had candles lit all over the place. It was kind of subdued and dark. And I just felt myself transported into 14th century France. I felt like I was in this monastery, these deep, rich voices kind of echoing off the stone walls. And I just had not felt in years so tangibly close to God. Like I literally thought I was going to open my eyes and have a monk's habit on, and who stole my Honda, untie my bow tie, whatever, and I'm just kind of having this sense. And it was so rich. And I don't know when it happened, but at some point in saying these Latin phrases and feeling God's love just kind of oozing over me, I don't even know what happened, but at some point I started thinking about this cell phone ad I saw and how I was kind of wanting a new cell phone, and I was, in my mind, I was going through the different minute plans that they were offering and trying to figure out how how could I justify a new cell phone with Cindy and which ones are better, and trying to convince her that this is for ministry reasons and it's all for the kingdom, sweetheart, and I don't know, but all of a sudden it was over. Like the guy stopped singing. And I had somehow been transported from 14th century France and feeling the love and the presence of Christ to really figuring out how I'm going to rationalize a new phone. Now, have you ever done that, or is that just me? Right? Have you ever been here and worshiping or listening to, the teaching, and all of a sudden your brain is like totally somewhere else? And you're like, oh, come on. Everybody else here is holy. Everybody else here can stay focused, and then there's me. And then I got to stop thinking about those kind of things. And if how come I do that? Well, it's because I probably had too much caffeine this morning. I'm like a chipmunk on crack, and I'm just like running around. And if my life was more normal, if my kids wouldn't have pooped their pants this morning, or if I just, if I had a better job, then I could really stay focused. And then all of a sudden you're just beating yourself up and you're even more distracted. Oh, okay, so I've got the right audience today. So, unfortunately, our minds become so preoccupied with so many little things. We can't hold on to big things. We can't hold on to significant things. We can't hold on to things that actually could change us on the inside. Psalm 46 really begins to unpack some of this. Pascal, the famous philosopher, said, most of man's troubles come from his inability to be still. I think of one of my other favorite philosophers here, Eric Hansen, one time said, I'm only one flat tire away from a nervous breakdown. So most of us, we just don't practice the presence of God in our lives because there's just too many storms around us. We get too distracted, too many things blowing in our vision. Psalm 46 says it this way: God is our refuge and strength and ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam and the mountains quake with their surging. These verses tell us that, the psalmist understands that life has storms, that there are things, like it's almost like he's setting this up. Look, we are not trying to talk about some utopia, that God is our refuge. Storms do happen. Chaos happens. Even though you feel like, an earthquake is a strange feeling, because you suddenly, the thing that feels the most stable that you take for granted all the time starts shaking. You ever been in an earthquake? Those things that we just assume are going to not move are suddenly moving, and everything then feels a little out of control. And so, the psalmist is trying to tell us that. Like, man, even when the whole earth is shaking, you have a refuge, you have a place that you can go. And the reality is we all go through storms. We all go through shaking in our lives. We all have seasons that we have multiple things happening at the same time. And too many people I meet these days think that if they're in a storm, that means the absence of God. That if things aren't stable in their life or predictable in their life, God must have disappeared. We all do it. We all go through storms. Emotional storms, financial storms, physical storms, relational storms in our lives. And it's in the midst of that kind of chaos, these are like hidden storms. They're like storms that other people sitting next to you right now may not even know you're going through. But you've walked in here and you still kind of see the debris flowing around in your soul. It gets hard to focus. It gets hard to see God. You wonder, I'm in a storm, and that somehow means God's absent. Let me let you in on something. Especially if you lived in Colorado or places like this where we have big storms. The more intense the storm, the harder it is to see in general. That's why your windshield wipers go faster and faster and faster, right? You ever notice that? Like you're just trying to keep your windshield clear so you can see where you're going. And sometimes, the more intense the storm in your life, the harder it is to see God, but that doesn't mean he's not there. And a lot of you are carrying in this place today a secret storm. And you're trying to see God in the midst of it. And you're assuming people around you that they're just doing great and that they're a storm-free life. And the reality is, it's just not true. We're here trying to learn how to see God in our storms. You know, it's almost worse off sometimes in church because we assume the people around us are doing well. You know, and we look at them, we're jealous because they got a new car. You know, and I wish I had that car. But if you looked at their soul, you could see into their heart. They're like 2 payments behind on it and wondering why the heck they made that purchase, right? Some people get a promotion and you're jealous because now they got this great job. And how come I didn't, get a promotion in my job? And you don't realize that they're hardly sleeping at night because the job has put so much pressure on them. And they're in a storm because of it. Like, just don't assume when you look at somebody on the outside that they don't have a storm raging on the inside. That's why authenticity and transparency are so significant in the kingdom of God. That's why life groups are so important. That we got to have 6 or 7 people around our lives that just understand. We can share a storm with them so they can help us to see God. It's almost like they're our windshield wipers in life, clearing away the crap that's building in our vision, helping us to see God in the midst of things that are happening. That's why the Bible tells us to walk by faith and not by sight, to believe that God is there and He is a refuge and He is a safe place, even when I feel the ground underneath my feet shaking and I feel fear and I don't know what's coming and the dust is in the way and my eyes are burning. You know, Job said it like in the midst of his storm in his life. Job says it this way: but if I go to the east, He is not there. If I go to the west, I do not find Him. When He is at the work in the north, I don't see God. And when He turns to the south, I catch no glimpse of Him. But He knows the way I take, and when He has tested me, I will come forth as gold. When I make it through this storm, even though I don't see God, I know He's present, and I know that something is changing in me because I will trust Him. This is just what we need to begin to learn. Our trust, like the psalmist says, is not in our own abilities, not in our own understanding. Our trust is in Him. He will be my refuge. God, I may not see You, but I'm going to hold fast to Your word. I'm going to hold fast that You do love me. I'm going to hold fast to these things. As a matter of fact, when you want, Bill Johnson, I love this quote by him. He says, if you want the peace that passes all understanding, you have to give up your right to understand. There comes a point, God, I don't know why some of this stuff is happening. I just know I've got to trust You. I know I've got to believe You. I know that somewhere around me there is a great cloud of witnesses that they have made it through, that they lost everything and yet they still have found shalom in their lives. Like, I'm just going to have to walk by faith and not by sight for a while. I'm going to have to just believe You. Some of the worship songs that do that, when we're focused on the presence of God in our lives, then our circumstances become smaller. God begins to work in the background. He's trying sometimes just to get us out of the way, right? And so what really stands out in these words are that He is our refuge. He is strength. He is in our midst. God is with us. And so as the psalmist writes this, jump down to verse 10. He then says one of the most famous phrases out of the Psalms that many people have heard in this passage. Be still, know that I am God. That just makes a beautiful plaque on a wall. Right? But man, if we could figure that one out. If I could just stop, be still, be still, be still. Gosh, get it to, right? What if there's some truth in there? What if the miracle is you have the ability, no matter the storm in your life, to be still and just know that He is God? Well, I like this thing with really familiar passages. Sometimes I'll do in study, and it's just, I just call it the emphasize exercise. When I'll just take a really familiar phrase and then I'll just emphasize one word at a time. Let's try this for a few minutes as we close here. Be still and know I am God. Be. Doesn't say do still. Be still. See, we're so used to doing things over and over again, and we try to, part of to us finding peace in our lives would be doing things, controlling other people, making sure if I can get all them managed, then I'll finally have some space to be still in my own life, right? So I do all these things to other people to get them to do what I need them to do in order to be who I'm supposed to be. Well, it doesn't work that way, does it? How successful is controlling other people in your lives? Been, yeah. Right? Sometimes we try to control circumstances, and what God is trying to say is be present. Be. Even in a storm, even in suffering in our lives, something occurs when we just be. I have some friends who have chronic pain and suffering in their life, and I was just having lunch with a dear friend of mine the other day with this situation, and he says, one thing that he has really learned is to breathe in his pain. Stop working against it so much and just allow it to be in his body. I'm like, dude, I just take an aspirin. But anyway, no, but there's something about being, right? I'm not saying accept every illness that overcomes your life. Don't be passive and things like that. Pray for things. But there are also storms in your life that instead of working so hard to control something out of your control, control what you can. Being present, listening to the Father, knowing what He's doing in the midst of it. And you might find that He gives you the faith to speak to the storm and make it silent. Or you might find He gives you the strength to take your boat all the way through it to the other side. Just be with the Master and see what happens. Be still. We don't always need worship music going on in the background, Steve Furtick podcast in our ears, programs to help us move along and inspire us. Most of us already know what we should be doing, right? And sometimes it's better just to be still, like to listen, like to be still. Actually, in the Hebrew here, it means to let go. It means to just sit and stop. Now again, I'm not talking about being passive in your life. I'm talking about being ruthlessly trusting with your life. To literally let go and let God. To relinquish your need for control of things and stop. Sometimes even in our prayer lives, like we're talking to God, but that's what we're doing. We're talking to God. And it really is really a difference in maturity in your life when you start growing in your relationship with God enough that it's one thing when you feel free to talk to Him about whatever you want. It's quite another when God feels free to talk to you about whatever He wants. And to do that, we got to be still. We got to listen. I took our next level leaders a couple years ago, our young leaders, one time, Cindy and I took them to Fairview Cemetery and gave them an assignment to walk through the cemetery for 1 hour and not make one sound and not pray one thing. See if you could walk through a cemetery and not be distracted by all the tombstones you see, and only ask one question when you begin. Abba, how do you see me? And spend an hour listening. Well, we all had to check in our cell phones and leave them in the car. But when that hour was over, it was amazing. People came back with tears in their eyes. could not believe the loving words that God would speak to them, realizing that they just hadn't taken time to listen, right? Some of us, we can't be still because we're afraid of what God's going to say, because we've been taught that he's angry all the time. And I don't know, I don't want to be around somebody that's just going to yell at me all the time, right? That's not God's heart for you. What he wants to do is affirm who you are. Remind you again, over and over again, that you are his beloved. Be still. First Kings tells us, the story of Elijah in his storm and his fear in his life, and he goes to this cave, and he's God wants to speak to him, and he sends fire and earthquake and lightning, and God, it just says over and over again, God's voice was not in those loud, dramatic things. And many of you know this, but after the fire came a still small voice. And it was in that still small voice that Elijah heard, "What are you doing here?" But in the Hebrew, which is the language the Old Testament was written in, it's hard to communicate still small voice. And some in the actual root of those words was God's voice was in the silence. When nothing was happening, Elijah heard. It wasn't even a whisper. It was in the silence. Some of you are so hard on yourself when you try to take time away from God and you hear nothing. You may be hearing something even in the silence, if you realize God can speak there as well. Be still, know I am. Know I am. It was Moses who when his first encounter with God said, "Here's what I want you to do. Go set all the Israelites free, set the captives free, go back to Pharaoh, tell him, release my people." And Moses is like, "Hey, that's great, but who should I say is sending me?" And God said, "Just tell Pharaoh I am sent you." That's a lot of help. What do you mean I am, right? But those words contain so much. It's almost like sometimes I look at the Old Testament and God said, "I am blank." And throughout the Old Testament, all the way to the point of Christ, God is revealing who I am is. His character and his sovereignty and his power and his presence and his holiness. And it all comes together in the word of Jesus Christ. Know I am. Know this God that you profess to love. Learn about him. Study Jesus. I tell people, just read John 1-3 3 times. That's a great starting place for you. Just read it. Get to know this Jesus that you've fallen in love with. And see what he begins to say. You'll know I am. And you'll begin to realize you can be still and know I am is God. The word there is Elohim, which really, connotates this sense of almighty, all-knowing. God is bigger than any storm that exists in your life. Where you may be feeling like you're living in a hurricane, that hurricane is positioned in the universe that God controls. And to him, it's this big. He cares about your heart in the midst of it. But in light of eternity, in light of his power, it isn't as overwhelming as we sometimes think. And when you know and can be still and know that he is God, he will give you a perspective on your circumstances that you've never had before. And so I want to challenge you this week to be still and know, to be still and know I am, and to be still and know that I am is God. Let's stand.
Thanks for tuning in to a message from the Sanctuary Church. For more information and media, go to our website at thesanctuarywestside.org or follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube.